Okay, folks, I know I often start on this page and not the PowerPoint, but I just recorded the whole bureaucracy lecture only to have it not record. I thought it was recording, and alas, it stopped after 4 minutes. So great. Nothing beats doing a lecture on bureaucracy and have it malfunction on you. That is just quintessentially ironic. Anyway, generally speaking here, of course, we don't really like the bureaucracy here. We see some angry old white guys decrying the Environmental Protection Agency because it apparently destroys jobs and puts seniors at risk. I don't necessarily agree, but we're all entitled to our own camouflaged opinion. Silly discussion question here, of course. Do you have a positive or negative impression of bureaucracy? Loaded question, I know. None of us probably will own up to liking bureaucracy, right? When I ask this question, usually the first thing that comes to mind is the DMV. That is, of course, a state bureaucracy in any given state. I recently moved to Texas, and getting my cars tagged was a royal pain in the backside. But that's just, it's part of life, right? Unfortunately, although we don't like bureaucracies, they are part of our life and they're not going anywhere. Why don't we like them? I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that we think that all public sector entities just waste money, right? Around 70% of us this day and age, up from about 50 in the early 1960s, think that the government just wastes our tax money, right? We don't seem to mind the fact that money is inevitably wasted, and it's inevitably our money, by private companies who make the things that we buy. But we don't like to stop and think about that, or we simply never do. We just blame the government. But zooming out here, what is bureaucracy? Bureaucracy can be defined as the complex structure of offices, tasks, rules, principles of organization that are employed by all large-scale institutions to coordinate the work of their personnel, right? All large-scale institutions, government and non-governmental. And bureaucracy is, of course, it could be a physical thing, like the root there, bureau, in French, literally just means an office, and it can mean a desk. So it can be a physical thing, bureaucracy, and it can also be a metaphysical thing, right? Principles of organization. But the core of bureaucracy is hierarchical organization that employs a division of labor and specialization, right? That's what we need. We have to have this because ideally this organization enhances efficiency. Again, many of us will say government's not efficient at all, but without government bureaucracy, I'm sure we would complain about the government even more because less would get done on our behalf, right? Bureaucracies allow governments to operate by allowing large-scale coordination of individuals working on a task. And it really is a concept as old as civilization. And again, businesses are bureaucratic too. We often don't like to admit this, but they indeed are. This is a silly cartoon from The New Yorker. A friend of mine gave this to me years ago and said to me, all cats are Republicans. He is not a Republican, but has had a cat for a long time. So the dog says to the cat here, "Who are you kidding? You're all about small government until you get stuck in a tree," right? And my father's kind of the same way. He's a lifelong Republican. And decries government all the time, says it can't do anything right, wastes our money. But of course, when you need something from the government, all of us are very quick to tell the government exactly what we think and what we need. What do bureaucrats do? A bureaucrat is someone who works in the government, right? Works within the bureaucracy. Bureaucrats implement the efforts of departments and agencies to translate laws into specific bureaucratic routines, right? They put legislation into routine. They can make rules, right? There's a quasi-legislative process that produces regulations, right? Once a bureaucracy is created, it's going to make rules over how it regulates itself, how it manages itself. And bureaucrats can also settle disputes through administrative adjudication. Bureaucrats can apply rules and precedents to specific cases. Say a couple of farmers have a dispute over some access to an aquifer or something, then before going to court, they might go to the Department of Agriculture just to solve whatever their dispute is, right? Why bureaucracy? Well, we've already provided two answers: efficiency and speedy and equitable implementation. But the third reason is old school politics, right? Legislators find it difficult, or find it useful, to delegate some decisions because they can't do and decide everything, especially when they're out, spending all their time trying to raise money for their next re-election campaign. But legislators sometimes lack expertise, obviously, or prefer for decisions to be made by more objective, in quotes, bureaucrats rather than self-interested politicians, right? So this says the bureaucracy is meant to depoliticize the implementation of the bureaucracy, right? So how is the executive branch, which is, of course, just one big bureaucracy, organized, right? We can talk about cabinet departments like the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Education, Department of Agriculture, I've already mentioned. We can talk about independent agencies like NASA. There is oversight, and the president does, nominate people to run NASA, and Congress, of course, has budgetary oversight, but NASA is pretty independent from the executive branch or from the rest of government. We can talk about government corporations that are government agencies that are meant to operate more like a business, like Amtrak and the Postal Service. They're not meant to make money per se. They're meant to provide a service first and foremost to the citizenry, but they operate more like a business, right? We buy stamps, we buy train tickets. We could talk about independent regulatory commissions, which are rulemaking bodies at least somewhat insulated from politics, such as the Federal Election Commission, right? We don't want those running our elections and overseeing our elections to be politically motivated, right? This is, I think, a fear that was highlighted, reality that was highlighted after the 2020 elections in places like Arizona and Georgia, and really around the country more broadly, right? So we would like the oversight of our elections to be as apolitical as possible. Here's the organization of the executive branch visualized, and we saw something similar to this, two different versions in the last batch of slides, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but you can see the president in the middle. The executive office of the president is the nearest to the president. Beyond that, the cabinet departments, and then beyond those, independent agencies, right? But these are all under the purview of the president, right, as the head of the executive branch, whether that's NASA, whether that is the EPA, so on and so forth. I'll leave this in here just for your reference. It's in the textbook, but if you keep the PowerPoint open while you take the reading quizzes and the exams, then here this is. I try to be as user-friendly as possible with this kind of stuff. But moving on here, we could talk about four missions of bureaucratic agencies. We talk about clientele agencies, which are those that have a mission to promote, serve, or represent a particular interest. And these clientele agencies typically have field offices close to their clientele. So like the Department of Agriculture has offices, I'm sure, all over my home state of Kansas, all over Central California, right? I'm sure there's a big office in Bakersfield, anywhere near where there is large swaths of farmland. And then, of course, we work all over the country, so I'm sure the Department of Labor has offices in all major cities around the country. We talk about the mission of the maintenance of the union, kind of important, keeping the country safe and running. And for this to happen, the government needs money. So that's why we pay taxes. That's why the Internal Revenue Service exists. And then we can talk of internal security provided by the Department of Justice, and the FBI, court system, so on and so forth. And then external security provided by the Department of Defense, right? Very few countries around the globe, Costa Rica comes to mind, abolished its military in 1948, I believe. A big country like the United States with a lot of enemies has a pretty hefty Department of Defense, which we'll talk about at the end of the semester. Regulatory agencies, another mission here. Department, bureau, or independent agency whose primary mission is to ensure that individuals and organizations comply with the statutes under its jurisdiction. This could be the Food and Drug Administration. This could be OSHA. which if you've worked in the food industry, you've probably heard of both of these. Again, we could talk about the Department of Agriculture. There are rules to how you farm. And so, it's not that that these four missions that we're talking about are unique to any one particular entity, right? But here you see FDA people inspecting papers and cans, keeping us safe. I sort of kid, but I definitely do like to eat. I'm a bit of a foodie, and I like to know that the food I buy at any given grocery store. Not every piece of lettuce, of course, has been inspected, but the FDA has a system to oversee inspection of the food supply, right? And that keeps us safe. We could talk about redistributive agencies. These are agencies that influence the money supply and the role of the government in the economy, and that redistribute wealth, right? So we could talk about, say, the Department of the Treasury, that is largely responsible for fiscal policy, so spending and taxing. We could talk about the Federal Reserve, that regulates the money supply, that oversees monetary policy. And we could talk about welfare policy, which encompasses a bunch of different agencies. But ultimately, these are transfers of wealth, right? We could talk about the TANF. I forget what TANF stands for, but it's what we used to call food stamps. That's overseen by the Department of Agriculture. But we can also look at Social Security, which I believe is handled by the Department of the Treasury. I'm not 100% certain. But Social Security is also a transfer of wealth. Of course, our older friends, my father will tell you that whatever money he gets from Social Security is his because he paid. It's his money. He paid into it. I mean, it is true that he paid into it, but what he paid into while he was working was transferred to people who were then retired. What I pay in now goes to my dad, right? He doesn't like to hear this. And again, he paid lots of money over the course of his career into Social Security, but ultimately, it's not that his dollars were just kept in a shoebox and now they're being sent back to him now, right? I mean, we transfer money within the political system among citizens constantly, right? And that happens through the government, right? Quiz question here: who oversees the bureaucracy? Congress, the president, the courts, the people. The fact of the matter is, all of these are correct, of course, right? Congress creates agencies, president oversees them. They can be controlled by, they can be taken to court. And then, of course, since we elect members of Congress, we elect the president, and the president and Congress nominate and approve the judges and justices in the court system, we have a role to play too. So all of these are correct, right? Different forms of control, of course, but and we as individuals have the least amount of control. But the fact of the matter is, we do have control, some say, over the federal bureaucracy and state bureaucracy for that matter. Let's think about problems of bureaucratic control. It could be one of motivation. We can conceive of bureaucrats as rational actors who are budgetary maximizers, but that's not necessarily the case. There is also some prestige that comes with running a larger enterprise. That's why CEOs who might make hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars a year, will willingly walk away from their very high-paying jobs to run government agencies. Not all of them do, not everyone does, but there are lots of examples that could be thrown out there from now to going back to forever. But bureaucrats, we hope, generally believe in the mission of the agency and want resources to do more. That's not always the case. I'll get to that point in a sec. But Congress and the president may have difficulty distinguishing need from want, and bureaucrats are to keep the others focused on needs, right? Again, we want the Congress and the president might have political motives for what they want, but again, the bureaucracy is meant to be apolitical and keep everyone focused on needs, right? Problem with bureaucratic control can also come back to the principal-agent relationship that we talked about early in the semester, where we are principals and we elect agents to represent us in Congress. But bureaucrats can be understood as agents of elected officials, right? As elected officials, principals, Congress, for example, creates bureaucratic agencies, and then these are staffed with agents, right? There's a potential problem here, though, when that we call bureaucratic drift, which is where implementation is more to the liking of the bureaucracy than faithful to the original intention of the legislation, right? Bureaucracies can sometimes drift away, if you will, from what their their intent was meant to be. They also can find themselves having problems with their principles, that is, Congress, where, say, elected officials decide to slash budgets of, I don't know, the Parks Department, federal park system, and then those who run the federal park system shift gears from being concerned about running the system to keeping their budget as intact as they can, right? So that can also be another form of bureaucratic drift. Let's think about how the president oversees bureaucracy. Presidents can do things before the fact, like appoint agency heads that can be sympathetic or not. And this was the point I was coming to a couple slides ago and said I'd come right back to it. You would think that presidents would appoint people to run agencies who are sympathetic to those very agencies. That's not always the case, right? The first head of the Environmental Protection Agency under the Trump administration was the former Secretary of State of Oklahoma, who, when he was in Oklahoma, spent most of his time suing the EPA, right? So then he's openly derided the EPA and then was appointed as its agency head. So, sometimes we can see the motive of the president and who is appointed to oversee the bureaucracy, right? Sometimes the intent seems to be the destruction of the agency itself from within. But anyway, after the fact, presidents can, of course, sign executive orders and signing statements. We talked about those the last time around. The president can make recommendations to budget changes. As the president, that's one of the things the president does, is proposes a budget to Congress every year. And the president can also propose reorganization of bureaucracies themselves. Congress, of course, before the fact, creates agencies, authorizes them. Congress approves those appointed to run them. And in crafting the legislation, of course, Congress can restrict what bureaucracies can do, right? After the fact, Congress can provide oversight in hearings and investigations. We know this. And Congress, of course, holds the purse strings, right? So has budgetary control. Here's a photo of now retired John Boehner, former Speaker of the House and pretty old school Republican from Ohio, but he was not a fan of government spending, often right there saying government spending is the problem. But anyway, it really gets back to the initial point that we started the slides with here, why we don't like Congress. However, we need Congress to do things now and again, like provide oversight. Many of you, I'm sure, were familiar several years ago with the scandal in Flint, Michigan, that started really at the state level. I don't remember all the details precisely, but there were decisions made in Lansing, the state capital, to shift the source of water in Flint, Michigan, and it ended up contaminating the water for pretty much everyone in the city. Had water that was discolored and full of lead coming out of their pipes, right? So the citizens of Flint turned to the federal government, as the state government was really the source of the problem. But anyway, here's another in brief thing from a previous edition of the text, but this has a summary here for you to consult as you need. Moving on here. Oops, did I skip a slide? Yeah. We talk about downsizing government in the form of privatization. This is an act of moving all or part of a program from the public sector to the private sector. And by doing so, this often reduces the size of government, obviously. Some responsibilities, public responsibilities, such as trash collection, can be privatized more easily than others. But nevertheless, privatization is an increasingly popular policy innovation because it is a way to reduce the size of government and ideally reduce the cost of government as well, right? It's not without controversy. There's often a means of economic corruption around the country, around the globe, through privatization. And then this is a photograph taken in either Afghanistan or Iraq, where the U.S. military has spent a lot of time in the last couple of decades, both places. And the federal government increasingly used military contractors instead of or in addition to U.S. troops. Most military contractors were former troops themselves, but the controversy lies in how they are regulated and overseen, right? What happens when a private military contractor kills an innocent civilian in Baghdad, right? There are problems with that in practice, right? So while privatization might seem a useful policy tool, it's not without its controversy. So, but downsizing government often seems to appeal to most everyone, the idea at least. And one way to downsize government would just be to eliminate programs and agencies. But this is difficult to do, particularly with clientele agencies, right? Farmers might have problems with the Department of Agriculture now and again, but would probably prefer it to be there because it is meant to represent their interests, right? So doing away with government agencies that actually serve people is tricky to do. We can talk about devolution, which is the policy of removing a program from one level of government, passing it down to a lower level. And this often happens with the federal government shifting responsibility to the states, and then states can often then pass the buck down to county and local levels too, right? So with that in mind, here is a legitimate quiz question. Which of the following levels of government is growing the most rapidly in terms of numbers of employees? Well, that's at the local level, right? We can talk about the size of the bureaucracy in terms of employees. This is, I got a series of graphs here, figures from pages 220 to 222 of the 16th edition of the textbook, but you can see that the number of people working in the federal government has decreased as a percent of the total workforce in the United States. So, we complain about the government, we think government's getting bigger, and in some ways it is if we consider government as, say, a percentage of the overall economy. We could make the claim that it's getting bigger, but in terms of employees, it's actually getting smaller. And you can see here's a variation of federal spending, that's what I mean by outlays here, as a percent of GDP. So the economy has grown literally by the billions since 1960, and government spending as a percent of GDP has stayed, I mean, it's varied greatly, and there are reasons why we see such fluctuations, but has held sort of steady over time, right, as a percentage of the domestic product. But how about government employment growth at the local level? Again, I made the point just a minute ago, local employment has risen steadily over time as the federal number of federal employees has been on the decline in recent years. Subgovernments in California, shifting gears to the Van Vechten chapter here, state government alone cannot provide all essential services, and so therefore Californians are organized into many different jurisdictions, which are areas governed by authorities with lawmaking, executive, and/or enforcement powers to deliver essential services. This may be counties or cities, special districts like water districts, or school districts, and these don't always line up. But the county level in California, like in most states, is really probably your most important sub-government within the state. There are 58 counties in California that vary greatly in size. The smallest is Alpine County with 1,200 people. The largest is LA County, of course, with millions, like 10. San Francisco is the only combination city-county. So there might be some overlap and going on there between those two entities. But counties were created to carry out state programs, and most of your interaction with the state government occurs at the county level. Counties provide essential services similar to the services that cities provide within them. Generally, counties are governed by 5-member elected boards of supervisors, and there are term limits that exist at the county and local levels if voters have approved them. Right? We talked about term limits last time around within the executive, but that is only at the state level. I love maps like this. This shows you the size of county by population. Just to give you a visual here, obviously I'm sure you're all from different parts of the state, but you can see LA County is by far the largest when you show it by size of population. Humboldt County is pretty big. North to south, it's quite quite long. I mean, I don't know, most of us have probably driven it north to south, but by population, you can see that it's comparatively much smaller than it is size-wise by extension. Counties versus congressional districts. Here's yet another subdivision, if you will. Our link to the federal government, most direct link to the federal government, is through our congressional representative in the House of Representatives. And California is now down to 52, I believe, congressional districts after the 2020 census. But of course, Alpine County on its own does not have one member of Congress, right? It's part of one much larger geographically congressional district. And then within LA County, you can see that there are lots of congressional districts, right? Because the idea is that all around the country, for all 435 members of the House, each member should represent roughly the same amount of people, which is somewhere around 700,000, right? So there you go. Within counties in California, they provide essential services. You can read the list on your own here, but whether that's public safety or elections and voting, whether that is education, vital records, these are often all handled at the county level. Paying for county services, right? The funds typically are in short supply. However, most states, California is one of them, requires at the state level for the budget to be balanced. And I'm sure that's the case at the county level as well. But most counties have these sources of money, whether that's the state paying for about a third of what goes on through state agencies, often at the county level. The federal government chips in about 17% through the state, trickle down to the county. Property taxes are collected at the county level. And then fees, of course, that we pay for using services provides some funding for counties, and then sales tax, of course. Sales taxes, licenses, permits, and so on. That we pay to the government. We complain about giving money to the government, but the fact of the matter is, if we don't, the government does nothing for us, right? City or municipal governments in California, there are 482 cities in California. Like counties, these provide essential services. They often overlap cities and counties. Often cities are governed by an elected 5-member city council. City councils govern with either a strong mayor, who is often very politically motivated, or a city manager who tends to be more professional to run a city. School districts, over 1,000 in California that provide K-12 education. We could talk of 112 community college districts. But whatever we're talking about here, we're often talking about, again, 5 elected members of a board of education. 40% of California's budget goes to education, right? That sounds high to me, but then again, I really don't know any other data to compare it to. But again, education around the United States is handled mostly at the state level. Other sources of school funding do exist as well, school bonds, federal grants, and so on. But 40% comes of the California state budget goes to education. Lastly, I'm about done. California's relationship with other governments is seen as such. California, although it's one of the largest economies, standalone economies in the world, has no direct diplomatic relationship with foreign governments. That's handled by the federal government. It's not to say that California is not interested in maintaining its relationships with federal governments, mostly for business purposes, but you can see here that direct contact with foreign governments is only done through the federal government. And then the state government has no constitutional ties to any tribal governments, of which there are many in California, 110 of them. But the state has no direct, under the U.S. Constitution, direct ties with tribal governments. I mentioned earlier in the semester, the U.S. Constitution provides nothing, no information at all, no stipulations for local and county governments. These are created and handled by the state government. And in practice, many tribal governments around California and around the country might indeed have relations with county or local governments in practice, but nothing constitutionally bound between them. Lastly, though, tribal governments are sovereign entities within the state of California and receive federal financial support. Again, no direct ties with the state itself. There are 110 recognized tribes within California and more vying for and deserving of recognition. Their impact today is often measured by gaming operations, for better or for worse. And gaming tribes tend to be big donors to state and federal election campaigns. So, we're back to the problem of money and politics. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. But anyway, there we are. I hope this did record and I don't have to do this again. But anyway, there we are. Take care. And I kept it at a half an hour. You're welcome.